Welcome to this special event being run by the LCP Wellbeing Network. We'll be looking at the subject of living and working with a disability at LCP. My name's Bart Hubie. I'm the lead partner for the Wellbeing Network as a whole, and also the lead within the network for our focus on disability inclusion. The event will comprise a discussion between Chris Bumford and Jamie Harding about Jamie's day-to-day experience of living and working at LCP, how that's influenced by his cerebral palsy. This is the first time we've had an event focused on what it's like to experience working at LCP with a disability. Around a year ago, LCP signed up to join stage 1 of the government's Disability Confident Employer Scheme, and this session forms part of our awareness raising actions related. Over to you, Chris.
Cool, thank you very much. Appreciate it, thank you. And thanks very much to Jamie as well for coming today to talk about cerebral palsy and your experiences with it. I guess the first place to start though, after the marathon, first day back after a marathon. How are you feeling?
Somewhat broken man. But getting there. Yes, glad for the 2 days off of the summer.
Yeah, no, congratulations on completing it. That's great work. I think we should probably start with sort of outlining what cerebral palsy is and what it sort of means to you.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of irony of it, I guess, is that I don't know a huge amount about the science of it. I mean, we might all get into this bit further, but kind of the approach my parents were always taking that I kind of took on as I got older is kind of deal with the practical elements of it and what it means in practice, and kind of taking things, one step at a time and each thing at a time, rather than kind of getting too kind of almost dug into the detail of the medical diagnoses and the treatments and stuff. So I have mild right-sided cerebral palsy. In effect, what that means is kind of as you go further down the arm, I have less and less movement. So I have pretty much normal movement at the shoulder, restricted movement at the elbow, and pretty much no independent movement at the wrist. So I can manipulate the wrist to make pretty much full range of motion, pretty much, but I can't send a signal to either my wrist or my fingers to actually make the movement independently. Broadly similar in my legs, slightly different, but broadly similar. And it also means, so my right arm is noticeably kind of slimmer and smaller than my left arm. That's purely a lack of use. So that's not like a direct consequence of the disability. I can't use my arm very much, so I don't use my arm very much, so I don't build up the strength in the arm. It's less noticeable in the leg because I don't hop everywhere. So that's kind of not much about the science, but kind of on a practical level, how it affects me.
Right.
And it's been since birth as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As well as glass since birth. So, I mean, in a practical aspect, I mean, I'm sure we can think of sort of things that might affect, but what do you notice most it affecting on a sort of day-to-day basis? Yeah,
I mean, it becomes, I guess, increasingly, I have to think quite carefully about answering that question, because clearly over time you find ways of doing things and that becomes your second nature. I don't know any differently, so it's just the way I do things. But I mean, simply put, I pretty much have to do everything one-handed. So a really simple example, as I'm sure many people around the office will have seen, is I almost always have a backpack with me, so that I'm not having to carry things in my hands, so that I've always got the left hand basically free, if that makes sense. So that's the simplest way I can put yourself in a given situation. Though I do have, it's not zero use I have of my arm, but the easiest way to try and picture it is that I'm having to do everything one-handed. Most of the ways in which that affects me are kind of in my personal life, daily routines, not so much at work, but there are obviously bits and bobs around the office that does me.
Yeah. So in work, am I right to say you don't have any kind of adjustments, particularly at work? So
not particularly, no kind of physical changes made. There are kind of certain accommodations that LCP have made, but actually that's been more about me kind of managing and supporting my own mental health more so than kind of a direct consequence of the disability.
Yeah, cool. Is that an area you wanted to talk about a bit more? Sort
Yeah, I assume it will probably come out more naturally.
Yeah.
I think the thing to say up front really is that I'm not sure how strong the science is, but as I've always understood it, there's a very strong link between cerebral palsy and anxiety.
So, I mean, you mentioned at work that it doesn't sort of, you don't have any adjustments and things, and you don't find it, I don't want to use the wrong words, do you think that when do you notice the cerebral palsy most at work? Is there a time, or is there a particular situation that you would potentially notice it more than others, or?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think as it relates to work, it's probably tiredness is the way in which it affects me most. So one of the ways in which I've tried to explain how my disability affects me is that kind of all the simple things in life probably take, don't want to put a number to it, but slightly more energy than it otherwise would because of the disability. So I have kind of less excess energy, if I put it that way, to kind of give to the more kind of, I don't know, less normal things in life and things like work. So, if I'm having a week where work's requiring a lot from me, and that happens from time to time, the extent of that time can ramp up very quickly because I get tired, but then I'm still having to do all the normal day-to-day things, and they take away energy, and it can kind of become a bit of a cycle. So I think that's the way it affects me most. Yeah, I think that's probably the best example.
I think I was going to say that most of the conversations we've had, you've mentioned cerebral palsy, you mentioned energy, and it's been around that. So yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. I've noticed that discussion. Moving away from work slightly, it'd be wrong for me not to touch on your sporting achievements and your
efforts.
Your sporting career. So, as an international runner, how did you sort of get into that? What sort of inspired you to do that?
Yeah, well, I guess I think I think it's important to bring this up, not kind of necessarily just the kind of self-congratulatory element of it, but I think it's also my most regular experience of actually being surrounded by other people with disabilities and actually exposure to different types of disabilities and experiences. Kind of very briefly, I guess my background in disability sport is it's somewhat gone full circle. So 2004, I did the London Mini Marathon. It's like a 4.5, 5K event. Just so happened that the person that organised that for my borough also was heavily involved in disability sport. He kind of tapped me on the shoulder at the end and said, "Oh, you seem to like running. You seem to be disabled." To put two and two together and started inviting me to some events. Kind of one thing led to another. And obviously disability sports, only when I was involved, it was making progress. It was starting to become quite a serious thing, but in terms of participation numbers and size, it still wasn't that big. So actually, if you had even some level of talent and quite a lot of hard work, actually you could, and you met the right people, you could get to some pretty cool experiences quite quickly. And I was just very lucky that I managed to speak to the right people, kind of showed the right attitude, I guess, and kind of got involved. So yeah, for kind of a 3 or 4 year period, I was involved in kind of the International Paralympic kind of scene, as it were. I never quite competed at the Paralympics themselves, but I competed at the World Championships in 2006. Obviously, a very cool experience. But I think also, I guess as it mostly relates to today, was also my first real experience of being kind of, well, one, I guess, really having to deal with my own disability because I was there because I was disabled. And I think that was the first experience I'd had of that. The only reason I was doing this is because I was disabled. Everything else in life, it was kind of, I was effectively living a normal life and making certain adaptations along the way, was that this was very much as a disabled individual. So that in itself was kind of an interesting kind of reflective moment, I guess, for me. But also meant I was surrounded by hundreds of other people with disabilities and the full range of disabilities. And I guess there was an openness about discussing disability because you've all had that experience. And it also kind of highlighted to me, I guess, what's the right way of putting this? There was a similarity that we all had achieved a certain level in sport, but in terms of the opportunities available to us outside of sport, you know, our access to education, our access to jobs and all the rest of it, the disparity was quite broad. And I think it kind of brought that into kind of sharp reality for me as well, that actually I was in an incredibly lucky position. I was going to a good school, I was doing good things outside of sport, and actually there were a number of people there that sport really was, you know, that outlet, and it needed to be. So quite an eye-opening experience.
I hadn't thought about that before. This sort of conversation you were able to have being different in that kind of environment.
I'm pretty sure I can't repeat any one of the jokes at all at these events. I'm sure I suspect we'll probably get onto language and kind of relating to one another about disability. I guess in that scenario, all bets are off. There's a certain level of understanding and respect inbuilt because you're all going through a shared experience. That did mean the gloves were off at times. But yeah, the jokes are probably best kept between me and them.
Cool. Well, on the topic of discussion, you're very open and talk about, you know, willing to talk about your disability and experiences. I mean, has that always been the case, or is there a sort of point that you became more confident about talking about things, or?
I don't think my level of confidence has changed around it. I think I've always been more than happy to answer any question or, you know, respectfully take any joke, you know, and doing it the right way. I think what has changed a lot over the years is my deliberate attitude to talking about my disability, because for many years my attitude has always been, right, let's crack on as normal, and then if I need something from you, if I need some support, I'll ask for it. I would ask that you be receptive and listen to that if I do ask for something, don't get me wrong, but I kind of almost did the work for other people in some respects, partly because I needed not that much, but I kind of, rather than put other people in that position of having to make those decisions. And I guess my attitude to that over time has changed, because I actually realised that I don't want to be grandiose, but I guess I was worried that people in my life weren't necessarily being better equipped to meet and chat and work alongside other people with disabilities by knowing me, because I was doing the hard work for them. They weren't kind of necessarily learning how to be a colleague, be a friend, whatever it may be, with someone with disability, because they weren't really having to deal with my disability in any true sense. So I guess over the years, I've kind of deliberately kind of started being a bit more open about my disability, almost at times forcing myself to be, not because I necessarily felt I needed it, but because actually this is a good example of what probably some other people will be experiencing. And the only way people are going to know how to respond in those moments is by having experience of that. And so it kind of became a more deliberate thing for me, I guess, over time.
Yeah, so I mean, you're sort of saying where you were doing the hard work there and sort of making it easier for the people around you. I mean, I'm sure lots of people sort of watching would be interested to know in what way they could take that hard work off effectively, and what kind of how that shows it, how what they would do to sort of carry the load, if you like, to do the hard work, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example of the sort of question that I suspected would come up in the session, and I should have a really kind of nice laptop ribbon and bow kind of answer to it. I'm not sure I do. I guess the word that keeps coming back to my mind is kind of engaging with it. I think, you'll often hear all the cliches around, oh, I didn't want to say the wrong thing or ask an inappropriate question. And I guess if I'm being really, really honest about it, I would challenge people to say, well, is that actually why you're not asking a question or saying something? I mean, university, with the people I work with the people I'm friends with, spend my time with, these people know how to be respectful. They know how to relate to other people. You know what an inappropriate question is. We all know the answers to these things, and that doesn't really change as it relates to disability. At least in a, you could put make the wrong comment here or there, but broadly speaking, I'm sure people know how to have a sensible, respectful conversation about it. I think, because I find it's true of myself in other spheres when it's not disability, I think it's often more driven by a desire to not be uncomfortable and not push yourself out of your comfort zone. And so there's there's a danger in consciously thinking, oh, well, I'm trying to be respectful to this other person by not asking this question. Whereas actually what you're doing is protecting yourself. And actually, I think the only way around that is to start the conversation. Because I think what I often find when people go through that process of starting to ask questions or starting to relate to things, actually, one, hopefully I'm supportive and helpful in the way I respond to those questions for others to judge. But I think also they often start to feel reassured in themselves. They can tell they're not putting their foot in it and not, they're not offending me. They're not doing these things. Actually, their confidence grows in discussing disability really quite quickly. And so, yeah, I guess that's the word I keep coming back to is just engage. I think once most people start engaging in the subject of disability, they'll kind of gain their confidence in it very quickly. And I think it will, kind of go from there. I think what I would say is my disability is probably one of the areas of my life where my own relationship with it is the least well understood. Like, I'm still learning about how I relate to my own disability. So it can become quite tiring, I guess, at times, to then be responsible for making other people feel comfortable about the disability. Most of the time I am comfortable about my own disability, and I have a good relationship with it, if I put it that way. But I go through ups and downs with that. I'm still learning about it. I'm further forward in my understanding of other areas of my life than I am my disability. So it's kind of helpful. Those conversations aren't just helpful to the other person, they're also helpful to me. So I'm going a bit around the houses here.
But yeah, I was just expecting that. But I remember, we were working together on the Wellbeing Network for probably 9 months and taught a lot about disability in general before I actually asked you about your own disability. And it just struck me that it is quite, it does feel quite intrusive to us. You and I were very happy to talk about it when we did start talking about it, but there didn't seem a natural moment to do that. And that struck me as quite an odd thing. I don't know how it felt to you.
No, there is when someone makes a comment or asks me about disability, there is almost I guess you have to have a certain level of comfort with someone to do that. And so I guess it's almost a gratifying moment, because it's someone saying, okay, well, I'm interested enough in you and I feel comfortable enough with you to ask this question. It's simple little things like, I won't name names because I don't want to embarrass anyone in case they're on the call, but I was talking about the preparations for the marathon on Sunday, and someone who I didn't know very well at all just said, oh, actually, I think it was something like, oh, do you find that your recovery takes a bit longer because of the cerebral palsy? I think they then did the obvious thing, saying, oh, sorry, that's the wrong thing to ask. But to me, that was like, oh, they're actually engaging brain about me. you know, because that's not a question you can ask of anyone else. That was a question individually for me, and they were clearly putting themselves in my shoes and thinking about my life. And so that was, I mean, my answer was a bit more into the question, but just kind of having that moment, I guess, was quite gratifying, that they're actually taking time to think about what my experience of the marathon would be, rather than, I guess, a more generic experience.
And I guess I think, yeah, what you said about feeling comfortable knowing somebody well enough. Yeah, we did work together for quite a long time. It was very sporadic, and so it probably did take that long for me to feel comfortable asking you that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't. It's very hard for me to put myself in the shoes of someone who doesn't have a disability, as much as someone without disability put themselves in my shoes. Like, I don't for a second judge or feel surprised or you know, anything about people that don't ask questions or don't feel comfortable. There's plenty of subjects that taken, you know, me time, or other subjects where I'm still not there to be able to ask questions or have found that comfort level. I know it's a process. I guess I would encourage people to just ask themselves that question of, are they doing it for the disabled person's sake or their own? And I think by answering that question, being honest with yourself, I've certainly tried to do it in certain other areas. You start moving on quite quickly.
Yeah, we've sort of discussed that recently. I can completely hold my hands up to thinking, yeah, I'll just do the safe thing, not say anything, and like you say, it's for my own benefit to make sure I feel better rather than.
Which is a natural instinct. I don't sort of judge it, but it's. I think if people think it's for the other person's, if they're not honest with themselves about it and they think it's for the other person's sake, it becomes a bit kind of self-reinforcing, because you want to keep helping that person. So you keep saying that thing. Whereas if you realise you're doing it for yourself, then you might kind of push yourself to step out of that comfort zone a bit earlier.
Yeah,
I think perhaps.
Preparing to fire questions at someone about disability also has
You've got the hard job.
Cool. So yeah, there's a few other things that I was hoping to cover. The neurodiversity events that we sort of ran recently, we had Daniel Ahern come in and talk about neurodiversity, and it talked about how each condition had its challenges, but also its sort of benefits and sort of skills. Do you feel like there are things that you can do better because of your disability? Do you think?
Yeah, well, this is actually kind of one of the questions we kind of discussed slightly in preparation. I think the one-word answer is no. And again, I think we're coming back to the same kind of self-protection. I think I've certainly had quite a lot of experiences actually of people wishing to find the positive in the experience. And I think with every intention of it being supportive of me, I absolutely understand that. But I think there's almost the self-protection that you want to find positive in a given situation. So if we're strictly talking about the way in which my disability affects my life, I don't think there was anything I'm better at as a direct result. There was about, I can't remember, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was this drive to change the terminology from being disability to differently abled, and people will have their own views, and I should say that kind of anything that's my view about language or the rest of it should be considered my view. Other people may have a very different view, and that should be understood and respected. But that really frustrated me, because I was thinking my right arm doesn't work differently; it works less. I don't, everything I can do with my right arm, you can do with your right arm. It doesn't work the other way around. Like it's just disabled. What I would say is, more broadly as a DEI principle, I think having some lived experience of otherness, I guess does help to bring a certain level of perspective. I think I intrinsically understand that no one without cerebral palsy can fully appreciate and understand my experience of having a disability. And therefore it's easier for me to understand that I won't fully understand anyone else's experiences, and their experiences will be different. And it's only through listening, understanding, discussion that I'll learn more about their lives. And so hopefully I have a level of kind of respect and understanding of other people's experiences. And I think that is, if that is true, that's a direct result of the fact that my life is different, if that makes sense. So I think that is a indirect benefit, I guess.
I did ask the question in the knowledge that like you were the person I think I've learned most from in the last 4 or 5 years at LCP, and it is that perspective, and you know whether it's I doubt it's completely independent from your from your disability, but it may be coincidental. But yeah, it's a great perspective to be able to have. We really appreciate it. When we first talked about this session, we were talking about a panel event. And we were discussing who we thought could be on the panel. And as we were discussing it, it became very evident that there was a difference in the legal definition of disability and people who sort of considered themselves to be disabled. And it's, I don't know how important that is. I don't know. I think the reasons behind it might be important. I don't know if you had any. I haven't posed a question, so please feel free to talk on the subject about me. But I was trying to. I think the point I'm getting at is I hope that the reason for that is not it is for the right reasons and not sort of a.
I mean, there is attaching yourself to the concept of being disabled is quite a big decision, I guess. I mean, for me, it's never been a decision. I can't think of any definition by which I'm not disabled. So I guess to some degree, I had almost that luxury of that decision being taken away. I still think there is obviously a stigma around the word disability. I think it is changing. I think we must recognise that there is really positive changes happening in people's perceptions and people's attitude. I think there's far more work to do in our own minute way. Hopefully we can do something with the session, but I think there is definitely progress being made. I mean, for me, if my attitude was always, if there's a stigma about being disabled, I had two options, which either consider myself less disabled or fully own it and try and be part of breaking that stigma. And for me, I don't know if I chose. I'm trying to be the second. So I'm trying to hopefully be a positive example of disability. I mean, I can't judge myself. I am being that, but I'm trying to be. And that felt more productive, I guess, than to try and disassociate myself with the term. So to embrace the term and say, no, I am disabled. But that doesn't have to mean I'm the perception that people may currently have of disability. I can, in my own way, influence what people's perceptions of that word are. Other people will have their own experiences. It's for no one but the individual to judge if someone has a disability or not. But that's certainly kind of the approach and attitude I've tried to have.
Thanks. I think that needs to lead me on to sort of whether you had any role models as a youngster or now, or people you looked at like you found inspiring, or.
I mean, short answer is I guess not. Well, I guess so. I guess at times. I mean, I've had loads of role models of inspiration. I'm not sure how many of them are disabled. I mean, there is. When I was involved in sport, there were certain individuals that you just look at and you go, it's quite incredible what you're doing. I mean, there's a story I've told before. It's a guy called Stephen Miller, who, if you happen to be really invested in Paralympic sport, you'd know him. He's one of the most successful Paralympians of all time. I mean, in Newcastle, I think is the third coming of Alan Shearer's the second. You know, it's but he's got very severe cerebral palsy, so he's wheelchair bound, has pretty much no control over most of his limbs. And we were just in the train station, and he one day just stood up and just went to the bathroom and was like, and just saying, and it didn't bring attention to himself. Just seeing this man, I mean, I'm not telling the story very well because you have to know the individual, you have to know the disability. We just go, the amount of hard work, the amount of strength, the amount of energy, the amount of self-confidence, the amount of independence that this man has achieved to be able to do the simple task of standing up and walking 50 yards. I mean, that was a very inspiring moment. Probably the most self-congratulatory thing I'm going to say. I'm going to regret having said this out loud. I guess there's been one or two moments where some of the most kind of fulfilling moments for me is almost moments where perhaps I played that role. So I was, for instance, on Sunday, we were doing the marathon. I was running for Scope. There was about 100. So Scope's a disability charity. There's about 100 runners. So obviously on the road, plenty of people came past me. It's fair to say. So over the course of the event, I saw plenty of people from Scope. And there was this one guy who, typical, but clearly a very good runner, but for some reason starting at the back, just didn't really have the sack. So clearly he looked like he knew what he was doing. But we happened to be standing side by side at one point, and we were just chatting. And he had two boys, I think 10 or 11 sort of age, who had mild cerebral palsy. And he said the main issue he's having with them is they just don't believe in themselves. And I think, I guess, slightly, it's finally starting to answer your question. I think part of that is probably that lack of role models. I'm not sure there are many choices out there. And so actually, he was quite gratified that he can go home that night and go, actually, I ran the marathon alongside someone that looks exactly like you. And I don't think there are too many examples of that. I mean, it's a well-known DI point that representation really does matter, but I think that story with that father was a really good example, because if you've got a 10-year-old kid with mild cerebral palsy and thinking this kid can achieve anything he wants, but he hasn't got that self-confidence, who do you point to and say, you can do it, look at X? There are people with cerebral palsy on TV or social media and stuff, but I can't name them. I mean, that's my own ignorance, but there isn't a plethora of role models out there. And I think, sorry, I know, quite a long-winded answer to the question. I think a lot of those role models are through sport.
Yeah.
And I think there's something great about that. I think the Paralympics, I mean, it's changed my life. But there's so many good things I could say about the Paralympics, but there is a real danger, I think, in the Paralympics being a pretty singular event in terms of portraying disability. I mean, you're effectively showing the people that the most physically able disabled people in the world, and you're showing only them. It'd be like, the only non-disabled person you see is Usain Bolt. I mean, that'd be daft. That would be intrinsically daft, but that's effectively what we're doing in the Paralympics. Yes, these people have these disabilities and it changed their life in a number of ways, but they are the most physically gifted examples of that. That's why they're there. That's why they're winning those medals. I think that to some extent limits their ability to be a role model in a broader sense. I don't think that's true representation, because not everyone's going to have that experience, that capacity, that opportunity. So I think we need much wider representation, kind of showing skills in other areas beyond the Paralympics. I think the Paralympics done brilliantly, but I think it needs a lot more help in this game.
Yeah, and I was going to say that in the business world, it's a struggle to think of many disabled role models that you can perhaps think of a few, but not the number you want to see. I think in business and wider world.
And certainly, I'd say very few that I'm aware of that also embraced being disabled. And again, this speaks to other DEI principles as well, as kind of there's a danger that you can kind of end up, you kind of almost try and manage that part of your life yourself in order to have this success. And so it can be hard to then kind of embrace that and be that role model at the same time.
I think that was backed up by one of the stats I read on that 1 in 400 children is born with cerebral palsy, and
what was the stats?
1 in 400
1 in 400
children are born with cerebral
Okay.
palsy, and I was like, I couldn't believe that. Like that means sort of on average, LCP would have 2 people with cerebral palsy. That it's I had no idea that it was that kind of order, to be honest, and that's just one disability. Then you've got others as well.
It's really interesting that actually. I was one of my best mate's wife had an adult diagnosis of autism, and she was saying one of the issues that she has, and I had never really realised this myself, but I looked up cerebral palsy, and it's largely the same. Is if you Google these conditions, so much of the information out there is focused on children. So it's how can you support a child with cerebral palsy? What's it like being the parent of someone with cerebral palsy? And she was saying this in the context of autism. Now I don't know how much that tallies with other forms of disability, but there does seem to be a lack of almost representation or kind of portrayal of adulthood with a disability. It's always, it's predominantly aimed at the support networks of these people, not the individuals themselves. And yeah, that's a recent realization, but I thought it was quite interesting.
Cool. No, thank you. We spoke a little bit about what I think there's plenty of allies on the call that would like to know what they can do or what sort of helps and what doesn't. And we really spoke about talking more and talking openly. Is there anything that you would prefer people not to do? Is there anything that to help avoid? I
don't think, and as I kind of alluded to earlier, I mean, all these answers are my own. I think there is we're hoping in future that we might be able to kind of bring forward kind of other experiences other people have had, and hopefully that will help to bring out some of the kind of diversity and experiences there. But for me, I don't think there's anything I'd want people not to do. And I'm certainly not suggesting people need to kind of feel like a pressure to arbitrarily or kind of involuntarily start making everything about my disability at all. But just kind of if a question arises or if a situation arises, just kind of perhaps lean into it, like just engage in the topic. And I would feel gratified by that, but I'm hoping that would have a kind of a broader benefit for the individual themselves and then other people they may meet in future. I mean, really simple example, really recently, is actually this was a good friend, not someone else as well. They got a round of drinks in, and we were carrying drinks over to the table. We'd taken them to the table. We'd been doing this, and he suddenly realised, oh, hang on, you're probably the wrong person. You can only carry one at a time. I probably should have asked someone else. So I didn't think. I was like, oh, no, that's fine. We haven't got many. It was absolutely fine to ask me. And I felt gratified because he, again, had that moment to think about my experience. And he's now learned that situation was absolutely fine. But he could have said nothing and then gone away and felt guilty unnecessarily, or reacts differently or sheepishly in another situation in future because he wasn't quite sure. In that scenario, he kind of made the comment, I responded, we all moved on, but actually I think we all got something from that really small exchange. So I don't think these are big efforts, but I think that is a really good example of, that was months ago and I still remember it now because there was something in that interaction.
Yeah, no, cool. I worded that negatively, yeah. But if there's anything else that is a positive that you would appreciate people doing and do.
Yeah, I mean it's
just generally considering and not being afraid to.
Yeah, I mean I must be honest. This whole experience for the last 45 minutes has been one of the biggest experiences of me just rambling and hoping something comes out of it. I have been meant to that before, but I find those questions quite hard. They're absolutely the right questions. I find them quite hard, and it goes back to the point that I'm still learning myself. I don't have a really clear idea of exactly what I need, what would make my life easier or help in certain situations. And so that, again, that's another reason just to start it. It all comes back to just start those conversations, because I'll learn as well. It's not a one way. It's not like I'm educating people. It is a shared learning experience.
Let's flip it around and say, what are the things? Have you experienced things either LCP or where you've actually thought that was just not a nice thing to say to me related to disability? So the sort of things I think people are sensibly nervous about engaging with the subject because they may say the wrong thing. So, what sorts of things would come across wrong to you?
I'm incredibly lucky to have had very few experiences of any sort of deliberate negativity. Hopefully that goes without saying. Certainly within LCP, of course, but even more generally, I'm feeling very lucky on that front. I think the most common experience I've had that has been very frustrating and upsetting is probably a strong term, but it's been difficult, is people accidentally and unintentionally belittling the experience. So, me starting to say I'm struggling with something or whatever it may be, and then again, probably out of that desire to kind of self-protect in some way, kind of go, oh yeah, I'm sure, yeah, I shall be fine. Can't you just do this or that? And almost trying to move on the conversation away from that kind of negativity. And there were moments where I felt, no, hang on, I'm struggling with this. I need to air this. I'm trying to learn myself about how to deal with this. By shutting down that conversation, you've made that harder for me. And then I start thinking, my condition is very mild. We've kind of put a microscope on it today, but I fully recognise my privilege in the fact that my condition is really quite mild. So I do have a lot of time where I question myself for, am I making too big a deal out of it? And likely the answer is no, but I do worry about that a lot. So when someone shuts me down that way, that can have a negative effect. It can be so easily done, because it was a close friend of mine recently about the marathon. We talked about, I was injured again, and it's like, how are you going to get over this? And I said, well, it's always going to be tricky because I'm always going to be disabled. And she kind of got a bit, oh God, what are you going to? And I was like, I said that flippantly, but that is true. I'm always going to be disabled, and I think it's also easily avoided, because it's kind of I think it all comes from a place of being uncomfortable and not wanting to be uncomfortable. So I think, again, in danger of repeating myself, by starting those conversations, becoming increasingly comfortable listening to about disability, I think you make those comments less often, because I don't think anyone would deliberately make those comments. I don't think anyone has ever meant to belittle my experience of disability. All they're trying to do is make me and them feel more comfortable, which is completely understandable. But if you're more comfortable to begin with, you're less likely to make those slip of the tongues, I guess.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I think it's sort of saying, it's not engaging, which is the thing that comes across most negatively for you, rather than engaging any sort of meaningful engagement is actually positive from your perspective.
But people at LCP are nice enough people and smart enough people that they're never going to deliberately say something hurtful. So if they're being deliberately engaged about what they're saying and thinking and asking, then they're going to be appropriate comments and appropriate questions. It's the careless comments, it's the thoughtless comments that can hurt, and they come from not engaging in the conversation, I think.
I don't think you're in danger of repeating yourself. If you're repeating, it's because it's the same answer. The answer is to understand, to talk more openly and freely. And absolutely, that makes sense. I feel bad now, because one of the final questions I was going to ask is something I've been doing to you just for the last few minutes. But I know when there aren't or many people with visible disabilities around, then it's very easy for people to put the onus on those people with disabilities to come up with solutions, to sort of essentially put pressure on to find solutions to any obstacles that that come up. Is there basically, is there any way that allies can kind of take that pressure off, and they can try and do the thinking themselves, and I don't know if people would have the right perspective, but is having a go and trying to come up with the solutions a good way of trying to avoid that situation where a disabled person feels pressured to come up with their own solution? Probably an unfair question.
No, it's a great question. I mean, people with lived experiences are always going to have a central role in kind of decision making or leading conversation. I think that that's always going to be appropriate in any area, particularly within DEI. Those with the personal lived experiences clearly have a central voice within it. I guess what takes the pressure off is being asked a question rather than passed responsibility, if I can put it that way. What can feel pressurized? I'm not saying I have had this situation, I don't think I have, but what would be pressurized is to say, like, Jamie's the disabled one, Jamie will sort that, not that anyone explicitly say that, but to effectively have that, to pass that responsibility. But to have a conversation and ask a question like, I was thinking possibly someone in this position might be feeling this one, might have this experience. But do you agree? And kind of understanding that I probably have lived experience and they don't, but kind of bring forward their own ideas and just showing an interest to engage in that and be part of the decision-making process rather than kind of passing it on completely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think people are. I've never really done it, but I keep I've joked with people in the past around kind of asking people to spend half an hour just trying to do every single thing with one hand, just any given day, just even if you're sat at your desk, just do every single thing with one hand, and light bulbs go off very quickly. You get a lot of I have had some people do it, and you do get a lot of feedback. People can't make up for you can't bridge the gap of a personal experience, but people are pretty intuitive and smart people once they put themselves in a position and really think about it and actually spend the time reflecting. And it's really interesting, the conversations I have back when people do that. I'm trying to think of an example. I'm not immediately thinking of one, but and it also speaks to the fact that every experience is different. It's like people come back and start telling me something they found difficult that I've never experienced. That's not the way I do whatever it is. And actually, but there might be other people that do have a disability that are more like that individual. So actually, that can be quite a fun kind of experiment to try. People willing to get themselves through.
Yeah, I haven't tried it yet. I think I'll have to give that a go.
Yeah.
Thanks. Probably the last question for me. I don't know if you've got many coming yet, but I was going to ask. So, in terms of we've spoken a lot about communication and things, and people sort of being able to talk about your disability and refer to it. And in terms of kind of knowledge, are there times that you prefer people to not know about your disability, or is it always the case you would like people to know? And sort of following on from that, can you see a sort of scenario where sort of, for example, people might mention their disability in their email sign-off or something like that, so people kind of always know essentially?
I've never thought about that.
Yeah.
Never thought about that.
I can't take credit for that. So Elizabeth's side.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
That's very good. I can't. The only situations I've been reticent about bringing it up are scenarios where it can feel self-congratulatory. So where it's something which is obviously trickier for me to have a disability. If it felt the reason for bringing it up is to somehow make an achievement or make an effort sound grander, that's where I feel reticent. But beyond that, I think it is more and more as I get older, I feel like it's a central part of who I am, and I think there's a lot to be said for for people being aware. So as I say, going back to being deliberate about it, I bring it up sooner than I have deliberately so. So
Cool.
yeah, the signature one's interesting.
Yeah, because I thought you would say, yeah, I'd always like people to know, and then it came to, why wouldn't it be on a signature then? Yeah, and then yeah, I was. It was an interesting kind of balance. So.
Yeah, I have to think about that one.
Cool. Have we got any?
We haven't had any questions yet. We've got a good audience, so thank you to the audience for your time. I know it's a really busy time for a huge number of people. We do have a question now from Ryan. So, yeah, from Ryan Wood. What advice, Jamie, would you give to someone growing up with a disability that you found useful?
Question. It is. I think there is a, and I was lucky for certain key people around me to help me with this. I think being a disabled child, largely because I lack of role models, can take quite a lot of self-belief. And I think, yeah, sorry, could give very long answers. It's finding a real tough balance. I'm 32 years old and I haven't found this balance myself at all. Between, I think it requires a lot of self-belief and trusting that you can do it, whilst also being kind to yourself about any restrictions or limitations or extra support you need. There's an intrinsic kind of contradiction within that, and I think. And I think that's a really hard balance to find, but I think in my experience, it is more often that people lean into the support that's needed, quite right, in all the rest of it, so that's good. That can lead to a lack of self-belief that an individual can be independent or have certain opportunities in life because they're not seeing those role models. So, yeah, I think the self-belief is key, and it can be hard to find. So yeah, it's a hard question. It's a hard question, but if I was sat down with a kid with a disability, I guess I'd be speaking to them about things that they do and things they like, and I guess I'd be deliberately, I guess you do this with all kids, but I'd make special efforts, kind of just remind them of how well they've done at that thing. And to remind them that they've made additional efforts and extra efforts, possibly beyond their peers, to be able to achieve that thing that they've done. Because there will be examples of some brilliant efforts they've made and great things they've achieved. And often people can find themselves in an environment where they're being reminded of what they can't do far more than what they can do. Not only that they can do, they have done. So I guess that would be the thing. It's just, that's where the self-belief can come from. It's not this aspirational thing of I can do all these things. Actually, sometimes you need reminding of the things you've already done. I guess that would be the approach, perhaps.
Okay, I think
I did have one more question. Sorry, just in terms of I know you have a wide range of hobbies, and it's sort of running and pool and poker. What I was going to ask, because so we would have a differing degree of impact on those things, and I just wondered whether you sort of noticed whether you
I'm
thought,
not very good at 8-card stud.
but whether you thought it had impacted that, or it appears you just play whatever you think you're going to enjoy and get on with it, and still.
I'm very lucky. Given the mild nature of my condition, there's very few things that are completely off the table for me, and that's a privilege I have, and that won't be true of necessarily other people. What I would say, I don't know I'm not sure if anyone is on the call. I think a lot of my experiences in the last few years of relationship with my disability from others, particularly colleagues in this case, being done right is the pool team. I think that is an example where it is a noticeable difference. I play differently because of the cerebral palsy, and it has a significant impact. And I put a lot of work in to try and address that and to try and improve. And I think the attitude of the rest of the pool team, in terms of we discuss it, we talk about it, they can be kind about some of the shots I make, because it can be tricky at times. But we don't, it doesn't have to become a constant topic of conversation, but we do discuss it, and it's part of the natural course of events while we're having a chat, while we're having a beer. And I think that's been a really positive experience. And I think part of the reason I've become so attached to the sport and so attached to the team is the kind of, really positive experience of how they relate to the disability.
Thank you.
Okay, that's a really good thing to end on. A very positive part related to LCP.
Yes.
And how you've experienced the disability. So I think time is very much up. So I'll just say thank you to Jamie. But I think you said you were rambling. I don't think you rambled at all. It's really fascinating insight. And it's into your specific experience with disability, but I think some of the more general points you've made have also been really interesting, both in terms of disability and the general DEI space and how those interact. And also thank you to Chris for, as I said, sadly your swan song, but a brilliant one, I would say, really, really good. And I know you've worked hard with Jamie at making this a special event, and I think it really has been.